when I'll talk to local and regional authors. So please join me Wednesdays here on 90.9 FM KSJE Farmington.
KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, which is officially baby-friendly. This evidence-based initiative is designed to support mother-baby bonding and optimal infant feeding practices by upholding the 10 steps to successful breastfeeding. San Juan Regional Medical Center, officially baby-friendly, and serving the Four Corners since 1910. Find out more online at sanjuanregional.com. Ten minutes past 8 o'clock. It's Thursday morning, October the 3rd. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Micklin. Thank you for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM here in San Juan County, 103.3 FM now in the Durango, Colorado area. And, of course, you can listen worldwide at KSJE.com. Special good morning also to our viewers who are joining us live on the KSJE Facebook page and YouTube channel. Welcome aboard, everyone. We're glad you're along with us. We have a great show planned for you coming up. My guest, Paul Reed, is here for his regular visit. We can talk to him usually by Skype from his home in the Taos area, but he's actually here in the studio. So we'll be talking with Paul live in the next few moments right here on KSJE. A number of recent articles that I want to ask Paul about regarding archaeology and areas of the Southwest and the North American continent. So that is coming up today at 8:10 right here on KSJE. Then, of course, next hour, Mick Hess will be here, Roving with the Arts, our classical music program. And today, Mick is playing music from the great Bartók. That is coming up today at 9:06 on KSJE, playing some violin concertos. We were just talking about the violin with my guest earlier. So some violin concertos by Bartók on the show at 9:06 on KSJE. Our weather forecast does call for lots of sunshine over the next several days here in the Four Corners. 80 for a high in Farmington today. A bit cooler tomorrow with a high of 78, but then much cooler for the weekend. Highs near 70 on Saturday and Sunday. And take a look at those overnight lows in the mid to upper 30s for Saturday and Sunday before things warm up a bit early next week into the mid to upper 70s. Well, let me talk to my guest who is here with me this morning. It's always great to have him in the studio and also just on the radio for that matter. Paul Reed is here, though, in person. Good morning.
Good morning, Scott. So glad to be here in person, in the flesh, and all that.
Yes, it's good to have you here. So welcome. You are in Farmington in northwest New Mexico, you were telling me. Your work brings you here, so it's great to be able to catch you in person for the show.
Yeah, it's nice to come back to Farmington. It's like putting on that old pair of gloves, right?
Okay, all right. That still fit, I suppose, right? Is that what you mean? Yes, exactly. Nice and comfortable and right. Familiar, so it's good to have you.
That's right. I fall into all those same driving habits, and
right.
It's kind of scary how that works.
It just, you fall back into it, don't you? So there you go. But anyway, it's good to have you here because I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a big project I know a lot of folks in the Four Corners are watching, and that is the anticipated realignment of Highway 550 in the Durango area. The whole idea is to eliminate that Farmington Hill part of the highway right. and align it into the big interchange that was built a few years ago with this in mind. And so the latest news is, of course, that there's been archaeological sites discovered on the path of where this proposed highway is going to go on the ranch there.
Right.
And this is not anything new, I think, for folks in your business, right?
No,
it happens all the time.
The Durango area, well, many areas, but especially the Durango area is blessed with an abundance of archaeological sites. And, of course, sometimes those are in the way of new developments and things that we have to do as our society moves forward. Yeah, and that's the case here. They're realigning 550, and there are some very interesting archaeological sites, and not small sites, but, good-sized Pueblo sites that are directly in the path of where they need to go. So those have to get worked on and, structures, artifacts studied, and,
right.
So that we can continue to learn about our past and allow the modern world to continue rolling forward.
And this is part of the state law and the federal law, right? That
right.
These things there needs to be a study for any type of construction project, and then if anything is discovered, like in this case, then there needs to be more investigation, I guess, and some research and documentation?
Right. Essentially, the trigger here is federal lands, federal money, by and large. And a lot of states and municipalities have also adopted some laws, but they sort of start at the top with the federal guidelines for that. And yeah, the idea here is that, as America began to, in the 1960s, really expand, and lots of historic buildings in our cities came under threat, so the Congress got together and passed the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. And that was designed at the time primarily to protect historic buildings that were disappearing at really a horrifying rate, as we had waves of urban renewal, which isn't necessarily a bad thing on its own, but people began to realize that lots and lots of our history was literally disappearing under the bulldozers and the implosions. So as part of that law, they were looking at historic buildings and at just archaeological sites countrywide, because of course as we grow and expand into new areas, we impact these traces of the past, and some of them are quite significant. So, and that's what we've got in this particular situation.
Interesting. And so we're showing an article from the Durango Herald, which has done a lot of work on this story, and of course, the headline says that the Colorado Department of Transportation says you can't save these sites that are in the way of this project, and I guess that's what happens, right? Would there be any case that you can imagine where a site would be so significant, so rare, so interesting that it would have to mean that the project had to either go around it or be redone?
Yeah, that's usually where we start, where the archaeologists start. We go out, we look at the land first, for a road alignment or the construction of a new pipeline, power line, any of these projects. The surveyors get out, mark an alignment, and then the archaeologists get out and physically walk that landscape. And so then our artifact sites are identified, and then the boundaries of those are mapped on the surface, and then the archaeologists go into consultation with the project sponsors and the state agencies, State Historic Preservation Officer, BLM, or whichever land managing agency is involved. And then basically the discussions are, well, we can avoid this site, we can avoid this site. So as possible, little minor realignments will protect a lot of the sites. So we basically call that an avoidance policy, and that keeps the sites protected on the landscape and allows the development to proceed. And I guess that probably 95% of what we find is ultimately avoidable with just a little bit of project redesign. Now in this case, this particular realignment and rebuilding of this interchange at 550, it needs to go exactly where it needs to go.
Right.
So there isn't a whole lot of leeway. Plus with this area of, it looks like Florida, but we say Florida Mesa up there. Right. That mesa is loaded with archaeology, with sites that date all the way from before the AD BC boundary, 500 BC all the way to 700 or 800 or 900 AD. So there's simply too much in the way in that particular situation, and so that's what kind of triggered, okay, we're going to study this, maybe we can shift the alignment a little here, but ultimately here is what the engineers need for the road alignment. So this is the area that the archaeologists need to focus on, and to collect data from these sites and not just let them go into the bulldozer. Literally.
Right. And that is my next question, Paul Reed, which is, do these sites then get bulldozed, or is there a way to maybe just kind of cap them and somewhat preserve them without destroying everything about them?
It really depends on the nature of the project. So I think in this case they're going to basically take apart the sites and learn what can be learned, and then the road will go right through the area where the sites were. I've heard
could it go on over the top of the area, or
yeah,
on top of it rather than through it?
There's some creative solutions that happen that way, where if the road grade can be raised, 6 to 8 feet, depending upon the situation, they'll actually put in, put down plastic and some kind of netting and aggregate, and then raise the road bed. So I know that that's happened in some cases, and then the site is literally sort of sealed under the road.
Right.
It's not accessible, so it is kind of there, but
not there,
gone in some larger sense, but it is preserved.
But somewhat protected too, I would assume then, right?
Right.
Is that the
right?
idea?
Exactly, and that's the route that most of the land managers and the archaeologists, and certainly when we talk to our tribal friends and colleagues, is we try really hard to leave the older remains in the ground these days. We were talking a little before we got on the air about how sort of the dig 'em up era in archaeology is we're making a transition out of that. So I think that with the situation at the 550 work, that this is probably going to become more rare as we go through time. But this is a big project, and this is where the road needs to go. So
Right.
we kind of circle back to that, and try to learn what we can.
Sure. But this opens up I know a lot of folks who read this article and who heard about this issue were kind of upset that these sites were going to be either destroyed or covered up or bypassed or what have you, and that there wasn't anything that could be done. But it really is, as you mentioned, I think at the beginning of our conversation, it's one of those side effects of the modern era that some of these things just can't be saved, or you'd have a road with so many curves in it to go around all these sites, it wouldn't be feasible, right?
We already have that road.
Do we? Yeah.
We already have a curvy road that climbs Farmington Mesa, and
that's what they're trying to get rid of.
Hill. Yeah, and that's what they're trying to get rid of. So it is a real dilemma, and I think in this particular case, from what I know, talking to some of the folks involved, is this was a very deliberate process that they went through to ultimately decide that, okay, we need to focus in on these sites and do some focused excavations in order to recover what's here. And like I said, though, the avoidance policy is really what really drives most of what we do. And we learn a lot these days by just going out in the field and doing the surface work, mapping. We have things like ground penetrating radar, which give us a pretty good idea of what's under the ground. And we can do a lot of what we describe as non-invasive study at this point. And the other thing, of course, is we've done work now for over 100 years, more than that, in the Southwest and across the West. So we have really good collections of artifacts and things in museums that are largely untapped. So what we try to do at Archaeology Southwest, here's the commercial plug part of the show.
Okay,
Scott.
all right.
We call it preservation archaeology, and we start with those records, the artifacts, everything that's in museums, if we want to study an area and see what we can learn from what we already have in hand, basically. And then if we go out to do field work, we're pretty targeted about that. And if we do excavation, we're even more targeted. So again, sort of circling back to the era of dig 'em up, large scale things, we've pretty much passed through that in most parts of the country. And we're really trying to do archaeology in a much more respectful and responsible way. The other thing we do is we bring in Native American consultants and colleagues to get those perspectives and sort of drive the research in a different way. And for those of us who do this kind of work, it's been very rewarding to have those perspectives come in and just learn different things about these sites.
Right. And again, you mentioned that's within the last maybe 40 years that we've been maybe revisiting the way we do these types of things and these types of big construction projects. And prior to that, there may not have been any consultation or anything. It just would have been the bulldozers.
Well, right. And we really had the salvage era there. So like when major projects like, Navajo Lake went in, Lake Powell and these things, they did what's described as salvage archaeology. So they knew that they were going to flood large areas, and they literally sent the archaeologists in right before the bulldozers. So we've evolved from that point to planning projects, especially large-scale public projects, in a much better way. And when we do that, then we can figure out how to avoid a lot of the sites, and we can consult with tribes and find out if a particular site or an area, a mesa, whatever it is, has significance to that group. If we do that early enough in a planning process, then we can figure out, in some cases, how to shift a project over.
Sure.
And I think everybody benefits at that point. But that means if you want to build something, you can't just decide tomorrow you're going to go get a permit and put in whatever your project is. So it's a longer timeline. But, again, I think the planning process really helps all of us. And we end up with a better project ultimately, and we end up with folks who have connections to different pieces of land, land jurisdictions. They end up feeling like their thoughts, their input has been heard. And that's, what we should be doing as a very diverse public society.
Sure. Now, when you say it adds to the timeline of a project, I would imagine it adds to the price tag of a project too, right? To do all this the right way, the way you're supposed to do it, right?
Yeah, the environmental work is a consideration now, and I know that is something that developers sometimes bump up against and they're not real pleased. But again, we have 330 million people in the country and growing, and we have a reduced sample, if you will, of archaeological sites from the past, and we have environmental areas that have never been developed before. So I think if we do this wisely, we can balance these multiple things and still have the development that, is part of our modern society.
Right.
But you can't just decide tomorrow you're going to build a strip mall.
Right.
or whatever the project might be.
Sure, because it's going to take a few months to do these studies and figure out what's there, if anything. And I would imagine a lot of you and your colleagues probably could have predicted when this project was announced that there's going to find some stuff on that mesa because you know how inhabited that area was, right?
That's right. And the Colorado Highway Department, to their credit, knew what they were likely to encounter as well. So, and I think that's why this process has unfolded really about, from what I can tell, I'm sure there were, missteps here and there, but from what I can see from the outside and watching this publicly, I think they've done a pretty good job with it.
Right.
And, sometimes we have to do these types of excavations, and, they're going to learn a lot about these particular sites, and it will add to what we understand about ancient use of Durango, in that area.
Sure. And again, by being able to map it, I guess, and to add it to the already existing knowledge base, it's not like it's gone forever. It's going to be documented and can be used by researchers long into the future, even though these sites are going to be underneath this new 2-lane, 4-lane highway.
Right, and that's exactly right. And that's, again, sort of the premise of archaeology, and particularly preservation archaeology, is we continue to use what we've already collected from the past, we bring it into the present, and then as we look to the future, we have large collections of data that can be, applied to new research interests and questions, because those things tend to change through time. We're interested in this, we're interested in this, and what we need then is to have these comprehensive data sets to be available. And that also reduces the need then, in the realm of sort of pure research projects, to go out and find perhaps a pristine site and, do a lot of invasive art excavation that may not be necessary if we can draw on some of these other data sets.
And when that decision is being made, is that you're just trying to, when you have a project and it says we're going to impact half a dozen sites, we don't have time or money to dig them all up or to look at all of them. You have to maybe pick and choose which may prove to be the most interesting or most extensive site, I guess, maybe if you have a little bit of money to dig it up or to look in it, things like that?
Right. I mean, and if we're talking about just in the research realm and sites that aren't in a development, because, of course, that triggers a process like we're talking about for the road. But, yeah, if you're doing an archaeological project, you have the time to sort it out and say, well, I'm interested in the Pueblo I period, and this site seems to fall into that. But I also know that Pueblo I sites have been studied in this area, and I can go to this particular museum facility and see what they have for artifacts. So, and again, that's really the approach that our organization and a whole lot of others are really promoting these days is, do the archival research, do the museum research, sort out what you need, and then when you go into the field, you'll have a better idea of how to collect, the specific pieces of information, the data that are really going to help address the research that you're interested in at that point.
I see. And so as we look at this article from the Durango Herald, just in the final minutes talking about this topic, we see that there is kind of a dig going on. And so are they digging up every site that's going to be impacted, or if you know, and I know you're not part of this project?
Yeah, so the way these work is, the engineers ultimately settle on a right-of-way, and a lot of times, if they can do it, they'll reduce some of what they might typically want for the full right-of-way when they're going through an archaeological site, because they understand, we all understand, that the larger the area you're excavating, the bigger the price tag.
Right,
so,
I see.
So they'll focus in on just what needs to be worked, and then, the archaeologists go in, and based on the surface work, sometimes you know exactly what's there, or you think you do. You start opening that up, and, like this, you've got a pit house or a kiva that pops up. Buried structures are really the wild card in all this, because we see things that are on the surface that are, Pueblo rooms that come above the surface. But almost all of these sites, if they're, habitation sites, they have the buried large structures, pit houses or kivas, or, some combination of those functions. And those are the ones you don't know about until you start putting shovels in the ground. And then you go, oh, there's a big kiva under here. And then there's one here, and there's one here.
Over there, right.
And so I think in this case they were pretty careful to just dig those portions of the structures that were going to be in that road right away.
In the area. Interesting.
In the area of impact.
Gotcha. Paul Reed is my guest this morning. He works with Archaeologist Southwest. He's done some work with Salmon Ruins here in San Juan County as well. We are talking about some recent articles in relationship to the archaeology industry and what's been going on, one of which, of course, is the realignment of Highway 550 at Farmington Hill in the Durango area. But there's been some other articles, too, that you had sent me that were just very, very recent, within the last month or so. One, a favorite topic, I think, of ours is this migration of human beings into North America and new evidence about that, which I think is always fascinating. And the fact that in this one article that we'll show our viewers in just a moment, they're able to actually identify a footprint, right?
Right.
That's 13,000 years old or something? Is that what it said?
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
So this is something that, as you've said, we come back to this a lot because this is a fascinating topic, and every year or two we seem to learn more about when folks made this migration from Asia across Beringia, as we call it, the Bering Land Bridge area. Of course, at different points in our past we had extensive glaciation, and when the ice ties up so much water, sea level drops considerably, and you end up having a lot more land exposed. And so, and we think of this as a land bridge a lot of times, but the reality is that, at points when the ice was at maximum, this was a large area. And you wouldn't necessarily, as a person interacting in this landscape, would have had the sense that this was some kind of a bridge, and probably not necessarily, as you began that process, the idea that you were moving from one continental landmass to another.
Right. And we've got kind of a map that I'm showing from this article from Sapiens on the screen right now that kind of shows this. I think it really well done, shows kind of what we're talking about with this area of Alaska connected to this area of far eastern Russia, right?
Right.
That was a pretty, I don't know how many miles across that is, but it's significant.
It's a large area.
It looks like, right? If that was all ice or land or something, right?
Yeah, it's 1,000 miles at the ultimate limit. So it's a big piece of land.
Right. But that is the prevailing theory of how folks got to North America, and not prevailing, but pretty well accepted, right?
Right. In the archaeological realm, I would sort of put it that way. Well, and the other thing that's interesting is we have these periods of what we describe as sort of ice-free corridors, is the way they talk about them, with people moving across the land. The other thing we have is, as we look at this, you can see there's, a pretty good coastal route as well. So what's come up in some recent years in some study is that some groups probably just kind of hop down the coast in small boats. And we're taking that coastal route and weren't necessarily pushing well into the interior through Alaska and into what's now Canada, but may have just been working the coastal resources. And if we have folks who are used to doing that, they're getting shellfish, other fish, and really taking advantage of the coastal resources. Right. It makes perfect sense for that to be a route that would get them well down, the North American coast. And we're talking about hundreds of years, not thousands necessarily, if people are just moving fairly frequently. And these folks had temporary camps they set up, but they weren't building, large stone masonry structures and saying, this is where we're going to live for 100 years. Right. That comes later, is what you told us, right? Right. And again, if all this is, if there's some land and some coastline, it's not like they're out in the open water either. They're pretty close to shore, and they're just hopping along, as you mentioned, maybe along from coastline to coastline. Right. So we don't have, one of the other issues, of course, is we know that people worldwide at different points cross pretty substantial bodies of water in vessels, little boats that we would look at today, and probably not most of us would necessarily want to go across Navajo Lake, much less across an ocean, 6,000 or 3,000 miles of open sea. But, we find evidence that people crossed large bodies of water in boats that, seem to have done the trick. In this case, we're talking about a much more smaller scale movement with the boats. Right. But something that people have wondered about for a long time, and, and people have wondered how we could get, and it's not quite on our map here, but the very tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego area, has some really early sites at 15,000 years ago. And people have wondered how a land migration through all of North America into what's now Mexico, Central America, northern South America could have gotten people down there. Well, the coastal route is something that a lot of people are looking at now and saying this would have taken not that much time, ultimately, if you were just following those resources. Right. Now, I have to ask you about this one dot I'm looking at, which is in Pennsylvania. So is that just an offshoot that somebody just kind of went diagonally and cut across? Is that what we think? Or it's an early site there at Meadowcroft Shelter, Rock Shelter, and it seems to be legitimately early. So part of it,
compared to everything around it, I suppose, is that what we're saying, right?
Right,
Yeah.
and part of that is just about geology and preservation of sites, because we were actually I was talking about this yesterday with some colleagues, and the archaeological record gets created, people live, they create sites, they move on, and then through time, those sites mostly disappear completely from the record. So we have instances of erosion that completely takes the remains and mixes them, washes away hearths, even substantial living areas, and then other times, depending upon where we're at, we'll have a river lay down a whole lot of deposits during a flood. Well, that buries the signs of human occupation, and some of those don't get found at all until people come along later and excavate very deeply, and you're like, wow, there's a 1,000-year-old site here, but it's under 10 feet of silt from this substantial river. So the idea is that, probably, percentages are tough, but a large percentage, 75-80% of the sites ever made are gone.
Right.
Just destroyed by the natural processes of the world, erosion, deposition, all these different things. So what we try and study as archaeologists is this bare remnant fragment of the past that gets preserved in very interesting places because of the unique situations of, this particular site was on a high point, it eroded all around it, but this particular soil, setting was stable. So 1,000 years later, 10,000 years later, we can still encounter remnants of people there.
Interesting. Well, and you've told me before that, again, the climate of a location can also affect if something is preserved or not, and that's why maybe in the East Coast we don't see as many sites as we see in the Southwest because of our dry, arid climate, correct?
Exactly. The East Coast is, the eastern half of America is wet by and large. It's humid. The soil is super acidic, and so basically, we talk about the soil basically consuming sites.
Yeah.
This is, of course, the bacteria and all the other forces in the soil.
Nature at work.
You bury a piece of wood in Pennsylvania, 20 years later, you're not going to have anything to dig up.
No.
certainly,
your dirt will be a little different color than the surrounding dirt, but it's all dirt.
You'll be able to tell that something organic was in the soil.
Right.
1,000 years later, you might not even have that much of a remnant. So, that is part of this wonderful natural laboratory of the Southwest in our arid climate, which is dry and not humid even when it is wet. We have great preservation. So, so we take all the archaeological sites that were created, layer all these factors in, most of them go away. Here's what we're left with. And those are the ones we have to study. And I liken this to having, you've pulled out a new puzzle, and the family loves puzzles. It's got 1,000 pieces. But somebody's taken the box top and they shredded it. So you have no idea what it looks like.
Oops.
And then you pull it out, and the kids or somebody has lost 80% of the pieces. So you have 20%, and you're going, So people start working on different corners, and this person gets this, and you get this going, and you're like, this is what it is. And the other person says, no. Here's what's going on. So this is, a simplistic model, but this is kind of what we do as archaeologists. And sometimes I'm working on part of the puzzle pieces, and my colleagues over here are working on other pieces, and we're like, wow, this is really interesting. Sometimes it goes together and we agree, and sometimes we're like, no, it's not what I think's going on here.
Yeah, there's something missing.
So that is kind of the debate, the debates that ensue. And this is why, of course, if we can talk to folks who have other insights, and, back to, what we want to do is a lot of contact and consultation with native peoples who are the descendants of the folks who made these sites, we get other pieces of that puzzle, and we really learn a lot more ultimately, and maybe solve long-standing dilemmas, because people are like, no, this is what we use this artifact for, and then people are pounding their heads going, I knew it, or I didn't know it, but now I do.
Right.
So that helps us, as we go through the process. But basically, it is this kind of treasure hunt where, we've lost the instructions and we don't know mostly what we're even looking for. So we make the best out of the situation.
Okay.
And we do learn some things along the way. So I don't want to leave the impression that we're totally lost and we're not learning things.
Right.
But this is the challenge that ensues, trying to piece this back together.
Sure.
And come up with a reasonable explanation or possible explanation for the past.
Understood. Paul Reed is my guest this morning. He works at Archaeologist Southwest. I want to show this image of these footprints and have you explain this a little bit to us as well, because I think that's just kind of fascinating. But this is what we have, again, this article from Sapiens. And so this is some kind of I don't want to say infrared, but some other kind of analysis, right, of this
Right.
piece of dirt or landscape. And of course, to the naked eye, and a person like me, I wouldn't even notice that it looked like anything. But maybe someone in your line of work, you could see, because they're saying on the screen that you can see where the toes were and the where the heel was of this foot and things along that line. This is really just a footprint on a beach or on some sand that maybe
Right.
hardened over time, right?
Yeah, and this is where what makes this a really exciting time in archaeology is we have all this technology now that we can apply to study of the past. And this, someone might have gone, yeah, that kind of looks like a footprint. But with the different imaging and the
Right.
color imaging that gets added in, then we get those features really to pop out. And so that takes us to a whole new level of analysis.
Sure. And how do we know it's a footprint that's a historical significance and not just somebody stomping on the beach 300 years ago?
Well, right. That's all about the key word in what we do, which is context.
Okay.
So in this particular case, the archaeologists are studying the site. They have a pretty good idea of when it dates because of the sediments and the geology and the geomorphology. And then they're excavating and they find this impression. And, and this is something that takes a tremendously good eye too, because a lot of what we do in archaeology is we're working through, we get to certain surfaces, sometimes they're floors, sometimes we just literally call them surfaces because they're outside living structures. So,
Right.
but we start to work on those, and then, with a good eye, and the other thing is sufficient time and sort of changing light conditions, these things pop out, and then you really start to go, okay, there's a footprint here. We've got a little cooking area or a hearth over here. Here's a cluster of tools, and then you can begin to put back, sort of recreate that ancient campsite, and that's what they were able to do here.
Gotcha.
And that's, and again, and that gives us the connection to the humanity of those folks when we find the footprints, because it's like, wow. This is contact. And of course, we know that with the tools and the features, but I think direct remnants of, people's bodies like that in the footprints. And sometimes we get handprints, of course. And
Right.
in rock art, people will do the negative images there. That gives us that human connection. And I think, at least for me, really brings it to life. And that's a big part of why I do what I do, is to try to connect with people who lived in the past and really get a sense of who they might have been.
Right.
As
And
people.
to use your analogy from before, you're building this puzzle together, and all of a sudden you found maybe a bunch of missing pieces that go right
Right.
in the middle of this blank space where you didn't have anything forever, right?
Exactly.
Is that kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah.
And so this discovery kind of pushes back the timeline, I guess, for humans in this part of where they were found? Is that the idea?
Well, and it adds another site that is in the realm of what we talk about now as pre-Clovis. And Clovis is kind of this boundary that we've talked about in archaeology at about 13,000 years ago, where it's like, okay, we don't really have humans in the area, in the entire continents, the New World before that. And now, like with the map you put up, Scott, those are all pre-Clovis sites that have been well studied, and certainly some controversy here and there and debates about how things exactly sort out. But I think that most archaeologists now are at the point where, it's clear that people were here earlier than we thought, and we're finding more and more of these sites.
Interesting.
And, so we don't have to be Clovis firsters. That's what we call the people
Right.
in that group. It's there might be some younger archaeologists, but from my perspective, most of the Clovis firsters are people who are, well along in their careers and have sort of staked reputations and things
Gotcha.
on this approach. And that's not really what we want to do as scientists. Of course, it happens all the time, but
Right.
the whole notion of doing science and learning things is that there may eventually come that point where some new piece of information comes along, a well-excavated site, the right dates, where they're like, this particular theory isn't holding. And if you're going to be a scientist and respond to that appropriately, in my view at least, you're going to have to say, okay, this, what I was saying before, doesn't work. So you say, I was wrong. Those horrible 3 words.
Well, there you go. But you got to be willing to do that, I guess, from time to
Well,
time,
I think so.
your colleagues will call you out, I suppose, or
They do,
or
and-
write a bunch of papers that prove how wrong you are.
And then you respond in
Right.
kind, and you get into these academic debates that play out in journals and sometimes in the confrontations, which I've seen at conferences,
Okay.
where people get into quasi-shouting matches. And we're humans, so we want status. We're ultimately primates, right? We want to sometimes be the top person in the field, and we don't want to give up our perceived prestige and all this. But, again, if we're going to do science, then we have to be open to some young whippersnapper coming along and saying, old man, you're wrong about this. And
Right.
I think that's what we're seeing here with these pre-Clovis, lots and lots of these sites.
Sure. But you also get to use two of my favorite words, which is prove it, right? If somebody
Right.
comes up to you and says, you're wrong,
Yeah.
then you go back to them
Yeah.
and say, all right, prove that I'm wrong, and,
Right.
and let's see your arguments, right?
Right, and that's a real interesting point, Scott, because with the pre-Clovis sites, the burden of proof is sometimes very high if you're the old, silverback, to use the analogy, if the gorilla is defending your turf and the young pup comes along and says, well, this is what I think's going on. And they're not all young pups either. I don't want to make this seem overly
Not necessarily
ageist
generational, yes.
it's not all generational, but then you say, well, I need you to prove that. And most of the time, people do that, and if they're doing this right, they'll invite people who are the experts in the field to come see their site. And a lot of times people come away going, yeah, I'm convinced. But there's always a couple of holdouts who are like, you didn't convince me. And if we applied the burden of proof that some of the pre-Clovis sites are subjected to all of what we do, we probably wouldn't believe that we knew anything.
Right.
So,
Okay.
anyway, so that's, but science has to unfold in a human way. So,
Well,
that's all part of the process.
It's part of this ongoing conversation. And I know there have been widely accepted theories prior to what we understand today that have been debunked, and
Right.
our understanding has evolved over the generations. And so it's not something that's just brand new. I mean, again,
No.
that's why we have Aztec, because we didn't think that they were different people. We thought they
Right.
came up from Mexico, right?
That's
Central
right.
America. So.
Some of the misnomers live on with our place names.
Yeah.
There's not much we can do about that. But I think that the ball continues to roll forward mostly, and eventually, not to sound too crude, but the people who hold on will be crushed by the ball.
Well,
if they don't decide that, maybe the evidence does prove that. Or they'll just move on and pass into whatever's beyond
Right.
this life.
if they don't accept the evidence and that's been proven around them, I suppose.
Yeah,
So there you go.
and other people will write textbooks and bring in other voices, and eventually whatever we consider conventional knowledge will change.
Right.
But sometimes it's a circle and it's not a line. So that this notion of linear progress is probably not exactly what we're looking at. But
Interesting. All right. Well, Paul, we've run out of time
Oh, it's
on
hard
this
to imagine,
conversation.
Scott.
I
So
know we
little
could
to
go on
talk
all
about, but-
morning, but we unfortunately have run out of time. But it's always great to have you as a guest, and here in the studio is a special treat. So thank you for coming in.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, Scott, and hopefully back in the studio again soon.
We'll see you. All right. Very good.
Thank you.
Paul Reed, Archaeology Southwest at Salmon Ruins, my guest here on KSJE.
I'm poet Brenda Shaughnessy, filling in for Tracy